The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. 7. After-Death Environment, Possession, Aspirations, and States of Mind. Tuesday afternoon, March 8, 1977. Your world is like the negative of a photograph to me now, unfleshed, showing outlines and definitions, but of a transparent nature. I have to read in the perspectives that appear so realistically and colorfully to you. For my senses are not tuned into those neurological keys that cause the world to spring alive. Now and then, memory and imagination cause a sudden connection and I perceive a particular scene, knowing, however, that it is in ways a replica of a given space-time picture, but not the picture itself, and I cannot enter into it. That is, even though I creatively hallucinate an Earth environment of limited extent, it does not meet directly with your world at all, despite its reality to me. Perception of your world is possible, but in a dim overview fashion. For now, the reality is the ghostly one to me, its edges unclear, its motions blurry, and its most solid masses having a transparent cast. I view it as you might an unclear movie in which time sequences jumble. The speed is uncertain, there are bleed-throughs from one picture to another, and the sound is dubbed in, sometimes before or sometimes after the actors speak. I am more aware of general developments since my time than specifics. The physical world in which I once played my part still interests me, however, in that my ideas are still alive there. And though their vitality has weakened since my death, they still meet responses in the living and stimulate my own reactions. The ideas I expressed in life continue to move without me and rouse my interest. They form a pattern of energy, concern, and inquiry still connected to the part of me that gave them birth. To that extent, even now my interest in that world is lively. A strange word for the dead to use, perhaps, yet my thoughts in that respect are freer than they were in life, no longer restrained by life's daily experiences. If sharpness of detail is lost, I'm quite able to follow large patterns of thought and emotions with ease, perceiving them somewhat above the hard-bed reality of the world, rising from it like multicolored clouds of different shapes, colors, and varieties. All in all, then, I can follow the world's ideas and emotional climate very well. Realities connected with your own experience, but invisible to you, are quite clear from my viewpoint. Then, while ordinary events of a physical nature are unclear and shadowy, I can follow thought's masses as they form above the world, mixing with others, flowing in patterns sometimes light, sometimes dark or dimming, and I can perceive the intensity of emotion that drives them. As a rain cloud will surely bring a shower, from my standpoint it is obvious that certain thought patterns will bring about physical events suiting their nature. So it is with considerable interest that I watch those emotional and mental patterns that surround the world. Dawn has a glow that I no longer perceive, for I waken each morning from no bed to see the sun rising outside without curtains. Yet I do perceive the dawn of new ideas, the glow of peace or faith or contentment as these surround the earth, rising amidst the darker forms of doubt and fear. And while I rest, I no longer sleep in the old terms, though I may for the experience. Immediately following my death, I slept out of habit, but gradually did so less and less as my sensations of time altered. That alteration must also have come about gradually, but quite honestly I cannot remember exactly how it happened. There were some very pleasant dreamlike periods in which the adjustments may have taken place. Nor is it easy for me to describe exactly how my experience of time is different from yours. If I ask you how you keep apart your own memories, for example, while living in each separate today, you would not know how to answer, perhaps saying only that this was somehow accomplished without much conscious effort, building upon certain learning processes that must have taken place in infancy and childhood. You distinguished past from present very easily, and, having little conscious knowledge of the future, you need not make any deliberate computations in that area except for the formulation of future plans of action. In the same way, it is difficult for me to say how my experience of time has altered. I can see the world's thought patterns as I described them and the world's emotional forms at once, as you might see the clouds if you were high enough above the earth. I can also see my own life in the same way, in its entirety as I knew it, but also in ways that were unfamiliar to me then. The events of my own life appear open-ended to me. I see what I did, but also what I might have done, and can perceive the energy I sent out in directions that I did not take consciously. I can track my own influence then, see the thousands, no millions, of people I affected, as each of you affects the earth and its populace in far greater terms than you realize. Each contact, direct or not, counts and ripples outward so that each person's life sends out lines of contact intersecting with others on a psychic level, but quite practically in psychological terms. So after death, watching the tracks of one's own influence is perhaps the most fascinating of endeavors. The eyes of the dead are indeed opened through some such experience, and this probably accounts for the reports of private judgments by God, the final accounting, and so forth. No judgments are implied those terms, however, though each individual will of course interpret the experience according to his or own beliefs and characteristics. Perhaps the events themselves are even perceived in completely different manners. It is impossible to tell how long this takes in earth terms, but the inner dimensions of the experience are equally beyond description, for there is nothing in life to compare with the depth, breadth, complexity, or intensity of such a psychological multi-event. I could compare it to the tracking of a million lights simultaneously criss-crossing a night sky while a startled observer on Earth watches hypnotized, dazzled, feeling each light's distant flicker in the reaches of the universe, while at the same time knowing that each flicker and each other flicker originated in its own thoughts and existed within them and in the sky simultaneously. So are a person's life tracks projected outward, and so do they intersect with those of others, forming patterns of energy, causing new relationships, and triggering actions that never appear to earthly perceptions. Now, for example, it seems impossible that I was so minutely aware of the energy and extent, the far-reaching consequences of my own life. I do not believe that I could have understood, much less realized that the lives of all other persons had the same astonishing greater dimension. Most interesting of all, perhaps, these lifelines begin before birth and continue after it. The traces of my own life still intersect with and affect those living, and through my own knowledge of my contemporaries, their lifelines mix with mine and with the living as well, and their ideas still relate to mine or are used in whatever way by your contemporaries. From your standpoint, as a rule, the life tracks of the living are brighter and of greater intensity than those of the dead, but this applies only generally. The lifelines of the dead could be compared, say, with distant galaxies, while those of the living would represent your experienced world. But in actuality, often the intensity of certain thoughts and emotions is so strong that they remain highly volatile. In your terms, after physical death, the division between living and non-living has little meaning. There are gradations of consciousness, rather, divisions, with one blending into another, and psychological combinations both of identity and perception that are outside the physical system, but not within it. Some individuals return to physical life many times. Others live a life or two of great intensity and then follow through with ideas from this end, watching as the physical seeds of that creativity sprout, but from a distance. In my case, through this manuscript, I poke my fingers into someone else's pie, but my invitation, adding certain exotic ingredients that would otherwise be lacking in a confection that must, nevertheless, sit in the windowsill of your time, not mine, and be presented and eaten at the table of a world in which I can only be a shadowy guest at a banquet I partially prepared. Wednesday afternoon, March 9, 1977. Communications between the living and the dead must always be translations at best. We cannot directly intrude. The knowledge, experience, and insights of the dead are everywhere available, for they are part of the ever-changing lines of consciousness that crisscross the universe. They are, of course, divisions, and here I must again use analogies that are familiar to you in that my main lines of communication are above your own mental atmosphere, not implying superiority on my part, but suggesting the separation necessary. So there is a distance to be crossed in such communications, one that makes direct aspirations most unlikely. Such appearances are more like projected images of transitory nature that cannot take in space-time for long, mental traces not filled in with consciousness or flesh, but outlining spatial patterns in response to a communicator who naturally exists in a different kind of psychological medium. That kind of encounter is difficult for the communicator, for he must adopt a smaller personage or identity than the fuller one he accepts after death, and squeeze himself into a personal context now too small, relating to the living in ways familiar to them, but which he has outgrown. Not that love is outgrown, only the small context in which it is experienced, and the details often sought after by the bereaved relatives have lost their sharpness for the dead, while the patterns of the relationships have been experienced in deeper ways than the living can understand. The dead can grow impatient in such cases, and thus may prefer informal dream encounters in which the living do not clutter the mental air with requests for proofs and details that are, to the dead, beside the point and a waste of opportunity. For certain conditions must occur before even dream encounters can happen, and the dead are usually satisfied with a less direct but also less troublesome communication. This is often accomplished by the maintenance of a general, distant, but lively concern, and by mental messages of comfort, support, or inspiration sent anonymously, usually delivered exactly when the recipient expects it least, in sleep or when the mind is otherwise occupied. Otherwise, the startling effect of such encounters often blots out the message, overstates it, or distorts it in one way or another. The dead still love those they loved in life, but they understand the emotion far better than they did before, and in a way difficult to express, they do not miss the living. They do not feel absent from the living, only present in an entirely different fashion than the living can fathom. In this, of course, they have the advantage, and it is to relieve the loneliness of the living that the dead communicate, even while knowing that such communications themselves can make the living only more anxious. The dead in their way are jealous of their freedom, and sometimes their communications take the form of hasty, "Yes, I'm all right" messages shouted over a mental shoulder. Some people forget to send letters when they travel, caught up as they are in the new experiences. Similarly, the dead are so involved in their own adventures that sometimes they ignore the nagging of the living, whose thoughts rise up like mental kites with reminders, saying, "Why haven't you written?" And the adventures of the dead can be quite concentrated. After death, for example, I learned tricks of perception that I now take for granted. I can experience any season of my life in an expanded fashion, using a heightened memory that actively recreates events, giving me awareness of an event as I once experienced it, but expanded to include all those personal details that escaped me at the time, the subconsciously perceived events that couched the physical one. Or I can telescope the same season, experiencing, say, one given autumn which suddenly becomes a point of action in which the actions in all of my other experienced autumns are contained. These perspective tricks apply only to private events, not to world history. My position, if that word will do to describe my present psychological stance, is the result of my own interests, idiosyncrasies, and tendencies. In your terms, I am still scholarly, given to my studies, where others, for example, are concerned with emotional relationships and would be involved in different kinds of encounters, both with their own environment and yours. Friday morning, March 11, 1977. The fact of death does not turn the coward into a hero or the fool into a wise man. True. Yet those judgments are highly limiting to begin with, and death does bring a man into his own estate. That is, he sees his own characteristics and abilities in a clearer light, and after the first shock of surprise, he usually views himself with a more generous, lively compassion than he did before. On earth, few men are of evil intent. Most crimes are committed by those out to right a wrong, and are the result of tangled thoughts and emotions that strangle a man's knowledge of himself and others, so that he acts out of ignorance or is driven by a passion that is the only one he allows himself to feel. This passion also contains all of the inhibited power of those other emotions that clamor inside him for expression. And like a dammed up river in flood time, the energy finally bursts loose. Few men commit an act called evil for evil's sake, however, unless they confuse evil with good or justify it as the means to a good end. So in death also there are no evil men, and since understanding is clarified, there is no need for mean acts. Nor do the dead in any way possess the living. The dead are quite aware of their benefits. Consciousness in a mental body that does not age or decay, and the misconceptions of the living in regard to possession lie mainly in their parochial belief in the superior advantages of their estate over that of the dead. Living or dead, however, existence takes place initially in mental realms rather than physical ones, and it implies states of mind first of all. These states of mind are like mental houses built by each person that form the actual environment in which any reality is experienced. As physical houses in a given neighborhood may be similar in construction, style, and age, and as the people in a given locality may be attracted to it because of characteristics that fit in with their own, so too people from mental neighborhoods, making alliances on psychological and psychic levels, having mental friends and associates, for example, with whom they may never meet physically. Living, our acquaintanceships are larger than we know. Besides our relatives, friends, work associates, and others with whom we deal more or less directly, we make friends with writers we never meet, contemporaries or those from histories past, and our inner life becomes peopled with all of those who have affected us strongly in one way or another through our reading or other experiences. A chance line written by a favorite author can have a greater effect upon us and cause life-altering transformations far greater in intensity than any statements made by relatives or friends. Yet in life we largely ignore this kind of mental commerce. This inner neighborhood of mind has its own characteristics and draws to it others of like mind. Since such inner environments are open to living and dead alike, possessing no time or space boundaries, then under certain conditions the living may find themselves moving into mental neighborhoods that fit them all too well, emphasizing their own beliefs and feelings to a superlative degree and, it seems, with supernatural force. In almost all instances, obsession plus strong repression causes such conditions. Because possession in one way or another has been an issue relevant to survival theories, and because of my interest in such matters, I want to discuss this in some depth. First of all, there are certain distinctions I would like to make. Friday afternoon, March 11, 1977. As mentioned earlier, I do not agree with the normative schools of psychology, nor do I subscribe to theories that advocate the well-balanced personality as the end-all of individual or social achievements. Since people are demonstrably different in endless varieties of ways, in casts of mind, emotional and intellectual response, bodily habits and constitution, then now, as in life, I maintain the importance of the variances in human behavior. The cultivation of individual differences adds to the resiliency of the species and in countless ways, to be discussed later, contributes to spiritual and physical well-being. Many people are one-sided, and in my time as well as yours, literature as well as common disclosure speaks of the sportsman, the professor, the seamstress, teacher, the perennial student, the playboy, harlot, and so forth. Each person relates to ideas about the self in an individual way. A 50-year-old father may see himself primarily as a son, for example, where another man might be the father in all of his undertakings with others, even though he has no children of his own. A woman might relate primarily as a mother or as a daughter, or in your time particularly she might stress her affiliation in a profession above all other considerations. But it is idiocy to require the introvert to be an extrovert or vice versa, the sportsman to have the scholar's love of books, or the scholar to forsake his study for the sports field. Each person is possessed of leanings and tendencies that are idiosyncratic, eccentric, his own to be pursued and developed. Such tendencies often lead to the greatest developments in the arts, sciences, and religions, making possible contributions that would not have been made by better balanced persons. In these cases, common sense, logic, and the emotions are all used with devotion and care in the service of a prime interest or purpose, even if that purpose is not clearly perceived but only sensed. It is followed undeviatingly, even though its paths may appear tangled or convoluted. In obsessive behavior, on the other hand, common sense, logic, and the emotions are all to some extent repressed, shut out, strangled by a prime interest, so that the interest becomes a dead-ended road not permitting any side crossings. There are obviously gradations in both cases, but generally the gifted eccentric is expansive and expressive, using his abilities to an end in which he believes. The obsessive person, however, follows a delusion that he must protect against reason, logic, and emotional understanding, so he denies these, following a goal that is closed rather than open-ended. Any fanatic follows this latter pattern, and such persons possess a rigidity of attitude that makes them frightened of all change. People may be fanatical in small ways also where certain matters are concerned, while being quite open-minded in others. There are persons driven by desire of one kind or another, for knowledge, fame, achievement, or skill, who use the finest attributes of reason, discrimination, and emotionalism to uphold and couch their purpose. Such persons use their abilities, therefore, for their own individual goals, while following the natural bent of their natures. There are also those who refuse to use discrimination, reason, or honest emotions, but express sense and intuitional insights alike in the pursuit of a goal not theirs by nature, but foisted upon them by others. And of course there are persons in whom a natural purpose is cluttered with subsidiary obsessive ones. In cases of unreasonable obsession, the person is already possessed, in a manner of speaking, by acquired patterns not his or her own natural ones, but those adopted through fear. The mental neighborhood is highly charged, volatile, ready to explode, and the person forced to walk a narrow line, a tightrope stretched to the utmost, afraid to look right or left or to deviate from the patterned behavior in the slightest way. All life happening below must be steadfastly avoided. All of the personality's other natural leanings and intents forgotten, and the eyes of reason kept tightly closed. So the obsessive person is often spiritually blind, and even when his physical eyes are open, they do not respond with a lively gaze to others, but glitter with their own stationary light. They move to the outskirts of human commerce, and I am not referring here to the child or adult who delights in solitude, or to those whose natural ways incline toward contemplation, but to the strongly repressed obsessive personalities who bolt out their natural bents, following artificial goals not their own. Their world narrows both within and without, for they read only journals and newspapers that concur with their own views, deny any emotional contradictions, and censor any conflicting evidence from common sense. Such people may be brilliant and gifted, or they may be intellectual nincompoops and aesthetically ignorant. Their characteristics and methods of behavior are the important issues. As a result of this behavior, the inner self achieves only a dreary loneliness. The tightrope is raised ever higher to avoid the contamination of daily life, and even if such a person is surrounded by admirers, he can allow no real discourse. Nature works against isolation and loneliness, and even the lowliest of creatures is curious about the business of others. The animals are not recluses, but lively participators in a natural community in which isolation and relatedness each play a part. So such persons are led to search out those who they hope will understand them, while they are prevented from doing so at the same time, fearing that the self-disclosure might ruin the elaborate psychological facade so painfully wrought. So such personalities characteristically have two main behavior patterns, sometimes following one exclusively for long periods of time, and sometimes switching from one to the other. They are given to compulsive repetitive actions, mental or physical, and to explosive bursts of violent activity. The repetitive behavior is comforting and can follow a slavish attention to details or be expressed through compulsive repetition of certain thoughts or words, and the violence can appear as severe explosive activity of an inward or outward nature through the rupture of an appendix, ulcers, heart attacks, or such, as well as though, say, bad temper or pugnacious behavior. The repetitive nature of some acts, as cracking the knuckles, incessant talking with certain punctuating rhythms, or even loud table tapping, may also mask any violent characteristics. Any such activities carried on in habitual, unthinking fashion may combine both the violence and repetitiveness. Such people are those who need most to break out of themselves. They are lost in and to some extent possessed by intents and drives usually adopted out of fear at a young age. Often a parent or other authority figure is responsible in conventional terms. Actually, such persons often fear that their own energy will supersede that of the parent, and are also afraid, on the other hand, that the parent will not be superseded. In any case, their own thought patterns and lines of consciousness are particularly intent, relatively unaffected by others, and in a particular fashion unsupported at the same time, rising up without suitable foundation in the person's natural characteristics. As these individuals isolate themselves through censoring their experiences, they gravitate towards certain mental neighborhoods. They dwell in mental states that are like their own, volatile and charged, caught between the repetition of boredom and the release of violence. They milk their environments dry in that respect. So, also, they pick up and magnify any other such streams of consciousness, whether from the dead or living, hence frightening apparitions, ghosts, poltergeist activity, and so forth often occur in their presence, where the same repetitive yet explosive elements can appear separately or in combined form, and in an isolated, elevated fashion in relation to ordinary life. The incessant repetitive behavior of a mental nature causes certain stresses, as if in a series of small explosions of minor degree were so constantly occurring in a given area of consciousness that a rupture finally results, such as an earth slide that is accompanied by stones, dust, fallen branches, and debris. Only in this case down the deep walls of the ruptured consciousness fall all of those feelings, thoughts, and considerations that the personality had thus far managed to hold back. In self-protection, the personality summons all of its resources, its characteristic modes of behavior, and its obsession to cope, since it finds itself, relatively speaking, at the bottom of the ladder instead of on the tightrope above. This intensification of intent brings about a supercharge of psychic activity that seeks other reinforcement. And if the personality is near a mental neighborhood or mental state of consciousness of corresponding nature, it draws from that reservoir. The result can be the activation of an apparition, a ghost of threatening demeanor, who appears whenever the conditions are repeated. In most such instances, the ghost is not a person or identity in usual terms, but a played-back version, the lines of consciousness trailing from an identity as smoke may trail a fire. And the obsessive personality magnifies and focuses these through its momentary intensity, then projects them onto space-time, where, however, they will take only under certain conditions. The personality has attracted those lines of consciousness that are in tune with its own in an effort to reinforce its defenses. The behavior of the apparition will often then symbolically state the position of the obsessive person, who unconsciously feels possessed or dead inside. Sometimes such an aspiration may also be perceived by others, and there are certain atmospheres where the constant repetitive nature of these activities can be activated under like conditions. On the part of the obsessive personality, this is a therapeutic procedure. Seeing its own predicament so projected, the feeling of being apart from life and dead to the self, can bring about a shocking recognition of the dilemma, even though this may not be consciously recognized as such. The problem becomes the seemingly exteriorized ghost, upon which the person now projects his own situation. Before this, often no problem was even acknowledged, hence the drastic measures taken. Religious or psychological aid is usually sought at this point. The recognition and attention rendered bring the personality into needed contact with its contemporaries, allow the individual to ask for help, not for himself, of course, so much as for the ghost, and the entire affair serves as a catharsis. This does not mean that only obsessive people see ghosts, but that the classic cases usually involve such conditions, and particularly when the aspiration is not someone known to the perceiver. The appearance of friendly ghosts and aspirations of family members or loved ones can have quite a different basis, but in all cases there must be a coincidence of states of mind. Poltergeist activity, usually involving children, follows the same pattern as with the obsessive adult, except that the child is not usually as set in his ways. Often the child's anger is against an adult who is attempting to make the child follow other than his own natural bent. Here there is rage rather than fear, and the child may sometimes be nearly conscious of its behavior, practicing in secret with moving objects or playing sly tricks with its own energy. The repetitive pattern also applies. The child being overly obedient in many such cases, and the even behavior erupting spasmodically into violent acts or temper tantrums for which the child has been reprimanded. Earlier, I mentioned states of foreboding or anxiety in connection with the creative process. My own melancholy fantasies and precognition disaster dreams. When I was in such depressions, the most unpleasant associations from the past could be triggered by the most innocent stimulus. Not only images of sorrowful events I had actually experienced, but also doleful remembered scenes from novels or plays would rise to in my mind, and the most melancholy passages from philosophers or poets. Such fantasies would accumulate, peopled with characters from real life and fiction, deepening in gloom until they often erupted in disastrous forebodings regarding the future. My own death or that of others, the eventual ruin of the world, the demise of the universe, the end of all. As I mentioned, an artist might paint a series of dark landscapes or otherwise rid himself of his emotional tremors through his canvas. A poet might write a bleak ode to death. Others, in a further creative step, might unconsciously seek out the unknown shape of the future, their anxiety seeking a cause, and hence find it through a dream in which a future disaster is foreseen. Still others with a different cast of mind will seek out from the ever-present fields of consciousness those lines like their own, and plug in to fears that were before inactive, but latent as patterns, and seemingly bring to life again events or persons who are actually quite finished with such activities. End chapter 7. I thank you. Hope you're enjoying. Aloha.